Hey everybody, JC here with Volume 2 of Simple Builds. Today we're going to talk about alternatives to friction fit motors. On the workbench we have 4 rockets that use friction fit motors. Okay, we have Yankee, Viking, Wizard, and Star Trooper. They're all minimum diameter rockets. That means that the body tube is the motor tube. Okay. Now these 3 use 18 millimeter motors, and this one uses 13 millimeter motors. Now, I'm not a big proponent of friction fit motors. They just cause too many problems. It's very disheartening to see the engine eject from your rocket and then your rocket long darts. Or you have what appears to be a successful launch, and then when you're trying to get the motor out, it gets stuck. And you end up cracking a tube, twisting a tube, or snapping off a fin. So we're going to look at what we can do to modify these rockets, either if they're already built or as a new build to eliminate the friction fit motors. Okay, what I have on the workbench now are your 2 basic alternatives. You have your screw-on retainer and you have your engine hook. So they both have pros and cons. I like screw-on retainers a lot, but they do cause some problems, especially with retrofitting to rockets. So let's look at what the options are with the screw-on retainers first, and then we'll move on to the engine hook. All right, let's say that we want to retrofit this Yankee, which I've already built to specs, with this screw-on retainer. It comes in 2 parts. You have the part that attaches to the body tube, or in this case the motor tube, which are the same thing, and you have the part that retains the engine and the rocket. So the first thing you'll notice is that it's not going to fit on there. Okay, that's because this has to actually attach to the body tube. So to retrofit this, you'd have to cut off the fins and move them forward, and also make sure that once you put this on, the knurls didn't interfere with the fins. Okay, so that's a big problem. The other thing is your launch lug. Now you'll notice this is a lot bigger than the body tube, so your launch lug would have to be cut off and put on a standoff to work. And then the third problem, which is, I don't know, maybe it's the hardest, maybe it's not, is the motor block. Okay, so your engine block, it's put on there using this to a particular depth. Okay, the problem is that when you put this on here, it expects the motor to be in that far. So you're going to have to scrape out the motor block somehow, screwdriver, pliers, whatever, and then install a new one. So realistically, a retrofit using a screw-on retainer, it's not really feasible because you essentially have to destroy your rocket. Now, if you want to do this with the new build, you can pretty easily. Here's a custom rockets orbit that I built with a screw-on retainer. Okay. When I built the rocket, I made sure the engine block fit the screw-on retainer. I moved the fins up the appropriate amount so that they cleared. Now the launch lug already had a standoff due to the payload section. So it was relatively simple to do. I mean, all you'd have to do if you were building a different rocket would simply be to cut yourself a piece of balsa or basswood or whatever to make the standoff, and just make sure. Now you have to double check that it's not going to upset the CG and CP, but realistically, you're only making some very minor modifications, and I've never had a problem with a rocket that I've built one with a screw-on retainer. All right, moving on to the engine hook. Now, the engine hook, we have to somehow decide how we're going to put it on there, where it's going to go, and how we're going to hold it onto the rocket. Okay, so we have to know how far the engine block is inside the rocket because we want to put this tab right up against it. Well, we already know using this, right, how far it is. So all we'd have to do is get out a tape measure or ruler, measure it. It's 2.5 inches. We measure 2.5 inches up on our rocket. We mark it, put a cut in there, install it. Okay. We don't have to modify the engine hook. We don't have to modify the launch lug. Now we are going to have to come up with a retention method. Okay. Now, there are minimum diameter rockets that use engine hooks. What do they use? Well, we'll put this aside for a second, and we'll get out one of them. This is a high flyer. It has an engine hook, and it's a minimum diameter rocket. See? So, now what they use is they use this Mylar ring. Okay? And it's passed over the body tube, and it fits underneath the fins. Now, this solution is not really feasible for your Yankee for two reasons. First of all, your launch lug is already glued on, your fins are already glued on. So if you want to put this the same distance, which is about 1 inch, you're going to have to notch out these fins, and you're taking away about 20% of the gluing area away from the fin. Probably, now if it was maybe right in the middle, maybe, but you'd still have to redo this. So we come up with another method. What I recommend you do is take a piece of body tube. In this case, I have a piece of BT20, which is going to fit over this pretty well. And we're going to have to cut a piece out of it, and we're going to fit it between the fins, right? Now, I call this piece that we're going to put on here a fairing. You can call it anything you want, a cover or whatever. Okay? And so it's easily doable. So what about building a rocket like this from the beginning and having it use a hook? Okay. I mean, the methodology is going to be exactly the same for placing the hook, right? You're going to do your measurement with your spacer, determine where to put this in. And you're going to have to determine how you want to put this on here. Okay. And how much are you going to cut the fins open? You're going to slot them. You know, I think you should use the same method that I used on the Wizard, even though this was actually a retrofit. You know, cut a piece of body tube and glue it over it. Okay. So, I mean, it's not, you can do it ahead of time so that you're sure you have proper spacing, everything. Now, if you have a different rocket, say the Viking, which I showed earlier. Now, the Viking, depending on how you orient the fins, and they can be oriented in one of many ways, you know, this way, this way, this way, this way, whatever. Now, because it has a long root edge here, when I built this rocket, I used the Mylar ring, and I just notched out the fins as part of the build. So you can see that it's very easy to incorporate this into the build. I mean, this looks, for all intents and purposes, exactly like the design of this. And this is the model I used to build this. So incorporating it into your build at the beginning is very simple, depending on the size of the root edge of your fin. If you've got a really short root edge, like this Wizard does, I wouldn't recommend putting this Mylar ring in here because you're taking away almost a third of your gluing area. You know, personally, I think the fairing is the way to go. Now, is this the right size? It's up to you. You know, I've built rockets where I've had the fairing go all the way up over the top. I've built rockets where I put the Mylar ring right here, so it just barely covered over here. Now, with the Wizard, you could move the fins down a little bit, put the Mylar ring here, I'm sure it would be fine. Really, this is up to you. This is a very simple thing to build. It's a good way to make sure you don't have to friction fit your motors. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to do the actual build where we're going to install the engine hook on this Yankee using this engine hook and using this piece of BT20 body tube. Now, how did I come up with the size of this? It was a piece I had lying around. Okay. We're going to use the High Flyer as our model. Okay. So it has this Mylar, bottom of the Mylar ring is 1 inch from the end of the body tube. So that's where we're going to put the bottom of our little fairing. On our Wizard, that's what we did. We put it 1 inch from the bottom. Now, in this case, the fairing is 5/8 of an inch long. As I said before, only because that's the piece of body tube I had lying around. As an example, so here's a Star Trooper. This was built from the get-go with the intention of using this. So I had to move the launch lug away from the fin, move it up here. Here's our Mylar ring right there. And then the fairing goes from here all the way up underneath the Mylar tube. Works just fine. Haven't flown it yet, but if you're wondering about the strange colors, I fly in a place that has green grass, and a small green rocket on green grass equals cannot find it. Okay, when we come back, we'll start in on the build. Okay, I've gotten a few things together here before we do the build, just to make sure I don't have to do it in the middle of the process. So I have some little pieces of tape cut, about 1/2 inch. I have a little sandpaper, and I have our measuring tool we're going to use here. So what we want to do is we can't put it opposite of the launch lug because there's only 3 fins. But what we can do is put it on one side or the other. I'm going to put it right there just for convenience. We'll double check. Okay, so that's how far in the engine block is. So even though I've already done some of these things, I'm going to measure it for the exact procedure. So, okay, it is 2 1/2 inches in. Okay. So I'm going to measure 2 1/2 inches along the body tube. I'm going to put a mark on here. Now, it doesn't have to be perfectly in the center, but as center as you can make it. Okay. Now, I'm going to take my knife, and just slightly above this line, I'm going to poke in a little bit, because it may not be, there might be some glue in there or something else. The only bad thing about doing this is that if you make a mistake, it's kind of hard to fix. So, push it in a little bit. It's not going in. A little bit farther down. Okay. All right. Found it. Get our slit. All right. So now we have located where we want to put this. Okay. All right. So the next thing we want to do is determine where the bottom of the fairing is going to go. Okay. And the high flyer had it 1 inch from the bottom. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to make a mark here. 1 inch from the bottom. Oops. Can't mark with the knife. That won't do much good. Okay. So now the next thing we have to do is determine how big a piece of body tube do we need. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put it between the fillets. Make a little mark here. Now it's going to ride up a tiny bit because it's going to be going over the engine hook. But we're going to cut it off. And once again, this doesn't have to be exact. Okay, get that out of the way. See how that sits on there. Okay, looks pretty good. Now, for esoteric purposes only, I'm going to round off the top. That way I'll always know where the top is. So round off these corners here. I mean, do you have to do this? No. I mean, like a lot of things on this build, it's up to you. You can make the fairing really long. You can make it as short as you want. I mean, the Mylar rings are only about 3/8 of an inch. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is put it back on here at our location, and then we want to mark where the top is. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to sand the body tube right here so that we get the best possible adhesion when we glue this on. We don't really need to we don't need to sand the inside of this, but I'm going to take a little rough sandpaper here. And just like when you're sanding to put on fins, you know, you don't have to sand a whole lot. Just enough to get off the shiny part is what people call the glassine layer. Okay, that looks like enough. Now, one thing, when we glue the engine hook in, I'm going to put a little glue up here. It's not to glue in the metal. Okay, basically it's to help seal up the slit that I put into the body tube so that it doesn't end up crinkling right there due to ejection pressure. I've never had that happen, but I always put a little glue right there. So, all right, so the next thing to do is get a few things out of the way, get a little glue. Okay. Put it on my handy dandy paper towel. Now, one of the things I like to do is use these little skewers to grab a little bit of it. And then I'll use my finger for the messy part. Okay, so put a little glue right here. Doesn't have to be a whole lot. Basically, I'm just sort of sealing up the hole. And you do kind of want to get it to be a little tacky. Let me get over here where you guys can actually see what I'm doing. Okay. Now don't put a whole glob of it in there because it's going to squeeze. A lot of it's going to squeeze out. Okay. So that's done. I'm going to put a little more on the inside here. Now this isn't as easy to do with the skewer, so I'm going to kind of spread it around a little bit with my finger. Because, you know, if you don't get your fingers all gluey and messy and get stuck every place, then you probably weren't trying very hard. Okay, so now we got that done. Okay, so we're going to put the engine hook in. Now I'm going to tape it down here at the bottom to hold it in position while we mess around with stuff. Now, if you're concerned about getting a nice tight fit, you can take the bottom of your knife and put it in there, get it down there. Okay, so now we get the engine hook. It looks like it's pretty straight. So now I'm going to take the fairing, I'm going to put it over the top of it. Okay. And then I'm going to do the same thing with pieces of tape. I'm going to put them right along the edge here. Okay, and then I'm going to take the end of my knife and rub it down into that gap. I'm going to get it nice and tight in there. And then I'm going to do the same thing to the other side. Okay, because you want to get a nice tight bond with the edges of it. So if you want to put on another piece of tape, you know, knock yourself out. What I like to do is I put one down a little on the diagonal side. I'll put that one over here. Okay. Now, I have to let this dry for a while. Then when we come back, what I'll do is I'll put some glue around the top in case there's a little gap, because there's going to be a gap on either side of where the engine hook is. You know, so we want to get that in there. Like I said, we're trying to make it as tight as possible. Now, don't crinkle your tube or anything when you're doing this. Okay. All right. So when we come back, I'll pull the tape off and we'll see how things are going. Okay, so I'm sure that the glue is dry by now, so let's get this tape off of here and we'll see what we got. Okay, so what we're looking for is, nice tight edges. Oh, the glue's not going to stick to that. Okay, see, that looks pretty good. We'll do a little test fit. All right, looks good. All right, I would say that we're good. So let's just put a little extra glue around the edges just to sort of seal everything in. And then we can call this done. Okay. Get my favorite glue applying tool here. Now, all I'm doing here is just trying to get a little glue around the edges. I don't know if you'd call it putting a fillet on there, but I just want to make sure that any little gaps are filled up. And we'll, smooth it off with our finger and make a big mess as you usually do here. Now, you can just get the glue right in here. Okay. I mean, there's not a lot of sideways stress on this. So, because the motor's basically just going to press against it and move a fraction of an inch here. So, we're not really looking at it going out to the side or anything. That's one of the reasons I assume, based on the spacing from the high flyer, that they chose 1 inch as the distance to go up from the bottom of the rocket. All right, maybe we'll put a little up there just in case here. See a little hole. All right, so let's get this smoothed out. Now I usually just take a sort of a wet finger and smooth it all out here. Just to go backwards here. All right. All right. I think we can say that this is done now. I'll set that up here to dry. Clean this up real quick. Now, if you want to practice this, I would not recommend you use a rocket that you really like. Now, I cheated a little bit, okay, because I did it on a rocket that wasn't painted. So even though it's I'll say retrofit, right? If this was really going to be done on a rocket, what I'd have to do is once I figured out where the fairing was going to go, I would have to scrape all that paint off. Okay, so my recommendation for doing a trial would be to use a Viking, okay, because you could use the Mylar ring, you could cut the little notch out. The other thing that's nice about the Viking is it comes with 5 fins. And in fact, there's enough room in the cardstock to actually cut out a 6th fin. So if you have a problem when you're notching the fin or some other unforeseen problem occurs, right, you can very easily just, get rid of that fin, scrape off any glue you might need to. But, I think you'll be really satisfied with this. Okay. Now, there is another rocket, so we already discussed the high flyer coming with this stock. There is another rocket that you can buy, and I unpackaged it already. Okay, it's called the Extreme. Okay, get the card here. Now, the Extreme, basically, it's just a high flyer, but longer. So if you look at it, if you look at the fins, you'll see that they are virtually the same size. They're actually ever so slightly longer. Well, maybe not. Yeah, they are just slightly longer. And the interesting thing is the notch is in a different place. So I haven't looked at the build yet for it, but basically it's the same thing. It comes with a longer nose cone. It's got a Mylar ring. It's got an engine hook. So, if you want to try building a rocket without having to go through all the sealing of the fins and everything, then I would say practice on an extreme, because it's got the cutout for the fins already. It even gives you an idea of how to cut out your Viking fins. Okay. So hopefully I'll get this thing, after it dries up, next few days I'll get this thing painted, and we'll attach the nose cone, and we'll get it up in the air, and never have to worry about a friction fit motor. So now we have a Yankee, we have a Viking, and we have a Wizard, all with this retrofit, along with our, actually not a retrofit here, our Star Trooper built from scratch that way. All right, well, that's the entire video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you have any questions, as always, put them in the comment section, and I will do what I can. And there'll be more simple builds videos in the future. Thanks a lot.